Are you going to introduce our speaker?
Yes.
Or do you want me to do it?
Would you like to do it?
Either one works. I don't mind.
You can do it.
All right. So it is my pleasure and great joy to introduce my friend and former stats buddy, Dr. Ignatius Nip, who is an associate professor and the interim director of the School of Speech, Language, and Hearing Science at San Diego State University. He is a trained speech language pathologist who received his degree from the University of Alberta in Canada, and he obtained his Ph.D. in communication disorders from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, where we met. His research interests are in the motor control of speech production in children and adults with speech disorders, including those caused by cerebral palsy, Parkinson's disease, and head and neck cancer. And I'm very happy you're here. So if everybody could give him a round of applause, yay! And then
thank you.
Start, Iggy.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you all about some of the research that I'm doing here at SDSU. I particularly appreciate having the opportunity to talk to psychology students. So talking to students a little bit outside of my field, but as I hope you'll learn as I talk about my research, I think there are a lot of ties to what I do with what you might be interested in as psychology students. So I want to start off by saying, I should probably say something about the field of speech language pathology. It's a relatively small field that people don't know a lot about. And so SLPs, or speech language pathologists, are those of us who are trained to help people with speech, language, communication, and eating disorders. I know the eating kind of feels like it's separate from everything else, but because we have such good knowledge of all the structures that we need to talk and overlaps with the way we eat, that kind of falls within our scope of practice as well. One of the things I really love about this field is that it's a truly interdisciplinary area, and it's a profession and field that draws on connections and research and evidence from a multitude of different areas of expertise, including psychology, linguistics, genetics, neuroscience, biomechanics, physics, and a lot more. And so for those of you who may be interested in learning more about the fields of speech language pathology and audiology, which are counterparts that look at hearing and disorders of hearing and balance, you can go to this website, hearingandspeechcareers.org, to find out more. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you would like. Just want to give you a little bit of background about my own sort of career path. And so as Maria mentioned, I'm from Canada. My parents are from Hong Kong, but they independently moved to Vancouver, where they met, had me. I spent my childhood there, and I did my undergraduate degree in linguistics at the University of British Columbia. At that point, I moved to Edmonton, so just across the Rockies, to train as a speech language pathologist. So in Canada and in the United States, it's required to have a master's degree to practice as a speech language pathologist if you want to practice clinically. So I worked in a city just sort of a little bit south of Edmonton for about 3 years, in a city called Calgary, best known for its Stampede, which is really just a glorified state fair. No shade to Calgary, but also right by the Banff National Park, which is very, very pretty. So I worked there for 3 years, and I worked in a school setting, primarily with preschoolers, with speech and language disorders, typically secondary to a lot of other type of disorders like autism, Fragile X, Down syndrome, and of course, cerebral palsy. And part of my motivation for wanting to go back to do research was that in my career at that school site in Calgary, we had a number of very vocal parents who, like most parents, want the best for their children, right? And so in addition to getting the traditional speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, et cetera, for their kids, some of them were seeking out alternate therapies. And so some of them were using hyperbaric chambers where they're putting their kids into chambers where they have like higher, like pressurized oxygen, with the idea that maybe that additional oxygen may help facilitate neural development. We also had a number of families who were going to a neuroscientist who says she was trained in France. Her theory was that by reducing stress or reducing cortisol in a child's system, you could see a lot of benefits in a lot of areas, not just in motor, but also cognitive and language and social, etc. And so her therapy involved basically taking kids into dark rooms, lighting candles, and having them smell essential oils. And that was supposed to fix things. It got to the point where it was so bad where she was kind of selling her pseudoscience as, you know, if you were to disenroll your child from all therapy and all sort of educational experiences, and you just do the therapy with her for, you know, probably lots and lots of money, the child would be cured of autism or cerebral palsy or some of these other disorders, which we know is not possible. You know, one of the things that my colleagues and I did, so my PT, OT, and speech language pathology colleagues, was we went through and dug through the literature to kind of demonstrate why what we were doing in our interventions and our approaches were so much better, had so much more evidence behind it than what this supposed neuroscientist had for hers. And that's when I realized and had the very uncomfortable realization that the evidence base for what we do as speech language pathologists for some of these kids is very thin. And so in some ways, I'm no better than this supposed neuroscientist. So at that point, I moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, where I got my PhD. And then I've been in San Diego for the last approximately 14 years. So just to kind of talk real quick about my own research interests is I'm really interested in speech motor control, meaning how do we learn and how do we use the different muscles of our face, our mouth, our vocal folds, our lungs in order to be able to produce speech. And so one way in which we do this is we use optical motion capture. So you can see in the top right, we have a little boy where we have reflective markers on his face. And we're able to use the 8 cameras that are positioned around the room. So they send out pulses of infrared light, those reflect off of those reflective markers, and we can reconstruct a model in 3 dimensions of the child's face as they're talking, which provides us with really fine-grained measurements of what they're doing with their mouth. Of course, this only really gets at the surface, right? These are cameras, they can only look at the outside of the face, we can't look inside the mouth. And you may wonder, well, why haven't we used technology to look inside the mouth, particularly of kids? And mostly, this is the reason why. It's much more invasive to get tongue movements. We're having to use dental glue to get sensors onto the tongue. Things have miniaturized now. This is when I was a doctor in Nebraska, where you literally would have to wear a helmet that was then supported by this like little crane. You can kind of see there's like a string holding it up in order to make sure that you can stay upright. And I'm a relatively healthy person without any motor control issues. So you can only imagine what it's like for somebody with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or CP or something else where they may not be able to stay upright with this additional weight. So in thinking about how we talk and how we produce speech, we have a number of different sort of stages. So the first one is we sort of have a thought, it might be a concept that we're trying to communicate to another person, right? So for a 3-year-old, it might be sort of this idea of, oh, I want the ball that my mom has, right? And then once they have that idea, then what they have to do is to then think about what type of sentence and what words am I going to use to be able to convey that, right? So we can convey that desire for that ball that mom has in a number of different ways. If you're a 3-year-old, we can say, I want the ball, so we can make a statement. We can ask a question, may I have the ball? We could do as a command, give me the ball, right? So we can kind of pick the different words that we want to use. And then we move our mouths in such a way that actually creates sound that then goes to the mom's ear so that she can interpret what the child wants. So that's a very sort of simplified model of how we produce speech. And so my research focuses primarily on this last area, sort of the movement part, where we produce movements and sound. A figure that you may have seen before is this idea of a speech chain, that generally speaking, if we have, the speaker on the left and the listener on the right, we start off with having a thought and coming up with a word. So that's sort of at the linguistic and cognitive levels. We then we plan those movements and we send those commands to the different parts of our vocal muscles. So at the physiological level, we're looking at the different muscles and things that are moving. Those movements ultimately generate sound, which then travel to the ear of the listener, which is then transduced into neural signals via the inner ear, the cochlea, and then to the brain so that they can, at the linguistic level, understand what it is that the speaker is trying to do. My research is really focused sort of at this level, and particularly around the vocal muscles, how individuals with neurological disorders and diseases, among other things, are impacted in terms of their use of these vocal muscles to be able to produce clear speech sounds that can then communicate their thoughts and feelings and all that stuff to a listener. So another way for us to think about the sort of the physiological level of speech production is to think about 3 parts of our body. We have our lungs, which generate the power for speech, right? So there's a 1-to-1 correlation with how much pressure we're able to have in our lungs with how loud our speech is, right? So without that power source, we can get to a point where we're just mouthing our words. You can make all the movements, but without that power, you aren't able to really produce that sound. At the level of the vocal folds, generally speaking, we think of this as our sound source. So by vibrating our vocal folds, we have sort of a general sound that we can produce. So, and then that sound travels up through our mouth, which is then further shaped or filtered so that we can get to the specific other speech sounds. So, so this is why, I can be saying or singing like an E, and so I'm kind of like vibrating my vocal folds at the same thing, but by changing the way my mouth works or what positions in, I go from an E, E, so my vocal folds aren't doing anything different. The only difference is the way in which the sound that's being generated in my throat is being modulated by the different shape that my mouth is taking on as that sound travels up. So that's why it's called the filter. So when we're thinking about our individuals who have difficulty talking, we have a number of different groups and populations that might have difficulty producing the speech. The one that I'm going to talk most about today are kids with cerebral palsy. These are kids who have had neurogenic differences or disorders that have been present basically since birth that causes them to have difficulty moving their mouths. But we also see this difficulty in another group that I study, such as people with Parkinson's disease. So this affects about 1 million Americans. And with the degeneration of the cells in the substantia nigra in the basal ganglia, the movements get smaller, and that can really impact how clear their speech is. And then a relatively new group that I've been starting to work with are our group or individuals with head and neck cancer. So there's about 52 to 54,000 people a year that get diagnosed with head and neck cancer or oropharyngeal cancer. And sometimes that oropharyngeal cancer can directly impact speech. So if you've got a tumor that's growing in your vocal folds, right, that's obviously going to impact the way you talk. But there are a lot of people where, there might be they might have a tumor at the back of their throat, for example. And so you would think, well, at the back of your throat, that's not really going to impact how you talk. And that is very true. However, the treatment that many of these individuals get, such as radiation therapy, can damage the surrounding tissue. So you might have a tumor at the back of your throat, but because of the way that they do radiation, it's also affecting your vocal folds, it's affecting your tongue and some other structures, and so you end up with difficulty talking. So that's another group that I'm looking at. Any questions so far? I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you. Okay. So moving on, let's talk briefly about cerebral palsy. So this is an umbrella term for a group of congenital neurological disorders that affect movement primarily. However, it also has secondary effects on cognition, speech, hearing, vision. And there's a lot of heterogeneity in which this disorder is expressed. I've worked with kids where the only thing that they have are ankle supports, and that's the only way that you would know that they have cerebral palsy. I've also had kids where they're in a wheelchair. We're not sure what they're seeing because they have literally no movement to tell us or confirm for us what it is that they're seeing. They're not talking. It's questionable because we don't have a reliable motor response, how they're reacting to sounds and things in their environment. And again, also still not sure about their cognitive functioning as well. So, so we have quite the range in terms of the kids that we see. The speech disorder that approximately 50% of these kids end up with is a disorder that we call dysarthria, which is a disorder that is basically due to trouble moving different parts of their speech mechanism. So that could be the power, the lungs, it could be the source, so the vocal folds, or it could be the filter, which is the mouth movements. And the primary feature of this disorder is that people will say that they're hard to understand, they're less intelligible, so they sound slurred. People will kind of say that they sound almost like they're drunk, even though they're only 4 and obviously, or hopefully, aren't drinking any alcohol. And so I'm just going to play a quick clip for you of an adult with dysarthria, just to kind of give you a sense of what it can sound like. So.
Female, age 63.
My grandfather. We used to know all about my grandfather. Though he is nearly 92 years old, yet he still thinks it's as if ever. He dressed himself in an old black frock coat, usually several buttons missing. A long robe rings through his chin, giving those who observe him from our student utmost respect.
Okay, so that's a very brief clip, and I wasn't sure how clear it was on your end, but what would you guess? How much of what she said do you think you understood? Like 0%, 100% of all the words, 50%?
I would say 0.
Zero,
And I think
okay.
we also have some 0 in the chat.
Okay, yep. And that's a very normal reaction to that. And in some ways, I like to tell my students, in some ways, your opinions are actually more valid than mine. So because I know the passage that she's reading from, and because I've worked with many people like her, I would say that she was about 90% intelligible for me. But your sort of reactions, I think, is very similar to what a lot of people would have with the encounter a recording like this, where they have a hard time understanding them, this individual. And so this idea of intelligibility is can be really profound, because it can really impact how well you can convey your ideas to another person, which then also impacts your degree of social connectedness and being able to make and maintain social relationships, which we know are the basis for a lot of other things too, right? Which can affect cognitive development and so on and so forth. So take a moment to read this. This is a sample of a reading passage of 100 words, and I've basically blacked out 20 of them. So we're getting 80% intelligibility. So if you can imagine yourself, and I am somebody with dysarthria, and this is what you heard, if you're to actually write down what I said, this is what you heard, how would you describe that sort of interaction, or how much information you were able to get from that like little sample that I gave you? Effective, not effective, got the gist, missing some details? Like, what would you, anybody want to give me your interpretations or thoughts about this? And no wrong answers.
We have missing details in the chat. I would also say that I understand the gist, but there's still not enough to 100%
Yeah, yeah,
understand.
yeah. You kind of have a sense of, they're talking about SLPs, a little bit about what they do and maybe where they work, but you're kind of, there's a lot of details that's sort of missing, right? So if we take away those, that blacked out part, we're now back at 100% intelligibility. You can kind of see, if you take a moment to read, you can kind of see how much information is missing, even at 20, when there's a 20% deficit intelligibility. So you can see sort of like with that additional 20% of information, we've got like a lot more context about what it is that I was trying to communicate to you about speech language pathology services and the settings and things that they work in. So what I hope the past few slides and the sample were able to show you is that dysarthria can be really devastating to a person's ability to function and carry out activities of daily living and participate in society. So we have research to show, and this is just in kids with CP. So I'm not including Parkinson's, we're not including people with stroke or ALS or any of the other multitude of disorders where this can be a problem for them. But generally speaking, these kids with cerebral palsy, if they have dysarthria, have difficulty with functional communication, meaning they can't get their needs met, they can't communicate ideas effectively. They have reduced social interactions. We see this in terms of not just on the playground and in the classroom or with peers, but even when we look at mother-child dyads, we see that the way in which mother-child dyad when the child has CP in comparison to a typically developing child is very different. The interaction is much more focused on the immediate context. There's not as much discussion about sort of abstract concepts or things outside of the immediate environment. The interactions have less to do with like imagination and pretend and play, and more to do with what do you want to eat for lunch. And there are times where even moms who know their child really, really well are missing opportunities or times where the child is trying to initiate interaction, and they're kind of hearing as a grunt and just not as sort of like a reflexive vocalization and not something with actual intent behind it. This impacts literacy, which in addition to the social interaction, the functional communication can impact academic functioning and progress. As you can imagine, if you are somebody that is constantly trying to tell people what you want and what you express ideas and nobody's understanding you, that can sometimes show up as behavior problems. And then when we think about these individuals long term, we have reduced vocational outcomes as well. Here, there is a framework from the World Health Organization called the International Classification of Functioning, which you may be aware of, where we can think about a health condition and then look at how it's affecting things at the body structure and function level, their activity level, their social participation, and all of this is informed by not only personal factors, but environmental factors as well. And so if we apply this to kids with cerebral palsy, you can see, we have the condition here. When we're thinking about the activity of talking, when we look at the body structure and functions, we're looking at speech movements, but participation outcomes might be fewer friends, a smaller social circle, and then we still have the same personal environmental factors that can interact with all of this. So the question might be, how have we studied dysarthria in this group and other groups in the past? And primarily, we've done it through auditory perceptual measures, meaning we would have somebody with dysarthria read some sentences or some words. We ask a listener to listen to it and write it down. Or we can also do some more sophisticated acoustic analyses to evaluate what's going on with these kids. What's missing, of course, is the movements themselves. Those movements are critical. Without those movements, we have no sound being produced. There is no speech without those movements, right? So without understanding the movements and how those movements are impaired in each of these different groups, we have real difficulties in really understanding how best to help these individuals and try to make them more effective communicators. So the other thing that's really interesting when back when I was a clinician trying to find the evidence base for looking at the disorders in this population and how to help them is that overall, when you look at evidence-based practice guidelines and the research itself, it's an understudied group when we look at dysarthria in kids. Part of that is, we know a lot about, generally speaking, by your first birthday, you should be producing your first word. By your second birthday, you're putting words together. You have about 200 words-ish or so. By 3, you're definitely talking in sentences. But beyond that, we really don't know, well, how do kids go from birth to like actually producing sounds and words, right? What is it that they learn to do in those first 12 months to actually even get to that first very basic kind of stage of being able to say mama? So we don't know that about healthy kids, let alone kids with these disorders where there's like difficulties in moving their speech mechanism, sometimes broadly called motor speech disorders. So when you are a clinician evaluating a child, you have no idea, you have no framework for what is normal, really, when you're kind of thinking about those speech movements. When we look at evidence-based practice guidelines for people with dysarthria, it's primarily focused on adults. So I think in the practice guidelines that I've cited here, there were a total of 22 participants who were adolescents or younger in the entire group of studies that they used to create these evidence-based practice guidelines. That's really not a lot of evidence to help some of these kids that we see now in our caseloads. And then the other thing too is that there are existing models and classification and taxonomies of this disorder are not entirely reliable in kids, and we're not entirely sure if it's valid. So that's a lot of setup to kind of get you to a point where I can actually talk about a little bit of my research in this population. So as I mentioned, I'm really interested in understanding why these children with CP and have dysarthria have difficulty being understood. And so the first place I wanted to look at was this idea of the sound source. So the vocal fold movements, right? So most of these kids are able to get their vocal folds to vibrate, but what we find is that when we look a little bit more closely at some of our acoustic analyses, we see some differences. So, so if you were to put a microphone right above your vocal folds and measure the sound so that you're not getting it as it's filtered through your mouth, this is sort of what you would see. Is you would see, say, in a child that's about 10, you would see them vibrate their vocal folds about 200 times a second. So that's that frequency in hertz. And then the relative amplitude or the loudness of that frequency is on the y-axis. And so because of physics, I'm just going to do some hand waving there and just say that because of physics, we just by vibrating your vocal folds at 200 hertz, you also get what are known as harmonics. So there's going to be a whole number of multiples of that fundamental frequency. So you'll also get a harmonic at 400, 600, 800, 1000, etc. When we look at healthy talkers, or when we look at any talkers, there's always going to be an energy drop-off between the harmonics. So it's always going to be a downward slope when we're kind of looking at these harmonics. And it's a bit of a Goldilocks problem. If you drop off too quickly, you have sort of a weak sounding voice that's not got a lot of body behind it, and not a lot of strength behind it. And so having that like too much of a slope, too steep of a slope means you have what we call a hypo-functioning voice. Your voice is not functioning optimally. It's functioning too little. On the opposite end, if the drop-off is too slow, there's not enough drop-off between harmonics, you get a voice that can sound really tight and pressed because there's additional energy at higher frequencies that you wouldn't normally hear in a healthy talker. And so that can be very distracting and unnatural, as well as potentially impacting how well you can be understood. So a colleague and I at our neighboring campus at UC San Diego, rather than San Diego State, and I looked at this measurement of what we call the vocal spectrum, the voice spectrum, and we see that there's a reduced spectral tilt, meaning the kids with CP look more like the one on the left. There's too much energy at these high frequencies, which makes them sound tight and pressed, and they have noisier vocal fold vibration. So they're not vibrating their vocal folds as cleanly, which means rather than sort of having these nice, like, oh, we have energy at 200 at the fundamental frequency, and then at all of the different harmonics, there's actually energy all over the place. Even in between these harmonics, maybe not as high, but that can actually make it really much more difficult for somebody to understand somebody's speech. What we have in studies in voice disorders is that by having that sort of like noisy vocal fold vibration, you drop your intelligibility by as much as 10%. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, as I kind of showed you from that example, even 10-20% can really reduce how much information is being conveyed in that communication interaction. The other thing that we want to look at was the filter, right? So the speech movements themselves. How do those differ in these kids with CP as comparison to their typically developing peers? And what does that tell us about speech production in this population? And as I mentioned before, we don't know a lot because some of the techniques that we have are pretty invasive, including, this is a picture from Iowa, where they're actually sticking in needles into muscles inside the mouth to get a sense of muscle activity as someone is talking. And so you can kind of see why a parent of a kindergartner might not be wanting to do that with their child. And so what we have done primarily in my lab is to use this optical motion capture system where we put the reflective stickers in this room where they're able to track these reflective stickers. And this is technology that you are probably pretty much aware of when you're looking at some of the behind the scenes features of a DVD, if anyone even watches DVDs anymore, making of specials, that kind of thing, where they're able to put reflective markers on actors and then basically animate characters and things like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. This technology has been around for a long time. It's also used in other fields, including physical therapy, where they're looking at like characteristics of gait, so walking, as well as in sports where coaches and things will do this to look at baseball swings or golf swings like we see in this picture. Another tool that we have in the lab and at our disposal is electromagnetic articulography, where we're able to use FDA-approved dental glue to glue sensors temporarily inside this mouth, inside our clients' mouths, and then have them sit next to an electromagnetic generator to be able to see, in a sense, what it is that the person is doing inside their mouth as they're talking. So we have that for some of our older participants. So in terms of summarizing a number of studies where we've looked at the speech movements in this group, one of the things that we see consistently is that if we were to look at, say, healthy controls in blue, right? And if this is the movement of their upper lip and their lower lip as they're talking, like if they're saying the word or the name Bob, for example, this is sort of the pattern that we would see. In kids with CP, what we see are movements that are much larger. So these are movements that are larger than they need to be, suggesting that they're not as efficient with their movements. And you might wonder why that would be a problem. Like, wouldn't more movements be better? And so this is a picture from my doctoral mentor who, this is his dissertation research from 20 years ago, where he used a very similar setup to look at how kids learned how to produce like the sound ba. And you would think, oh, that doesn't sound like a lot, but at the time that was really cutting edge. No one had really looked at this. And so we have a 12-year-old, not 12-year-old, a 12-month-old rather, a 24-month-old, a 6-year-old, and an adult. And so if we kind of look at the adult and we look at the baby, the 12-month-old, you can see both start off, they kind of have their mouth open. They close their lips as they're trying to get to that B for ba. And then you can see here in the middle, this is where we have like the maximal degree of closure of the mouth. And you can see here with the adult, like, you know, he's touching his lips together, but he's not pushing his lips together like the baby, right? The baby's like really pushing hard because he doesn't have or hasn't learned to sort of grade the amount of force he needs to generate in order to produce a clear B, and then they open up again. And you can see, you know, even by the age of 2, there's less of that pushing of the lips together, though that's still greater than what we would see for a 6-year-old or for an adult. And so we think that's something similar for our kids with CP, is that they have these sort of movements that are much more immature, I guess, if we were to compare that to sort of what we would see in typical development, and suggesting that they have difficulty in sort of grading the amount of muscle activity and force that's needed to produce speech. The other thing that we've seen in this group is that, you know, if we were to look at, again, sort of the controls in blue here, you know, we can see that the upper lip and the lower lip are going to start moving at the same time, they finish moving at the same time, and they're going to move proportionately the same amount as for both lips. When we look at the kids with CP, not only is that like proportionality off, so maybe they're not moving their upper lip as much as the lower lip or vice versa, the timing is also off, so that the lower lip starts moving before the upper lip or vice versa. So this sort of disruption in coordination is highly associated with intelligibility, a 0.78 when we look at the coordination of the lips. So this was sort of like a really exciting finding for me and my lab members. We kind of have something that we can measure that's associated with intelligibility, right? So something in terms of the movements which produces the sound with how well they can be understood, and at a pretty high degree too, 0.78, almost 0.8. It's, you know, as Cal, who was our Garvin, who was Maria, my stats professor, would say, you know, that's definitely time to break open the champagne when you have like a really strong association like that. So then what is sort of can anyone guess what the logical thought my lab and I had once we saw this result? So if we know that coordination is the key to intelligibility, therefore in therapy, we should focus on coordination. Exactly. Thank you, Tiffany. Yes, coordination. So the question is, how do you teach somebody to coordinate their speech movements? Any guesses? Yeah, I was the exact same way. No idea. Well, let me laugh. When we're talking about this coordination deficit, it's very hard to see because we're talking about really small movements, right? When we're thinking about the mouth. And then even if I could see it, how do I tell if like a 6-year-old who probably has cognitive impairments, as well as speech impairments, to like do these really fine-grained adjustments in an impaired motor system to be able to coordinate their speech movements. So thought, well, that's back to the drawing board. However, one of the things that we did as part of our experimental setup was we also tried to see what happened if we got these kids to talk in slightly different ways, right? Have them talk slower, have them really over enunciate, have them really talk louder. And a really fun thing that we found was that, and this isn't published yet, but we have, we're working on the manuscript, where we see that by increasing loudness, by having them talk louder, coordination of speech movements increases. So by having them talk loud, we can get that coordination, which potentially could increase the intelligibility. And there may be a number of reasons why this might be helpful. When you talk louder, you slow down, so that gives you a little bit more time to get, you know, your tongue to the right part of your mouth when you're trying to produce a sound. It makes it easier for others to hear you if you're louder. And potentially this coordination piece might also be a benefit. So one of the things that we have in our field is a treatment approach called LSVT Loud that was originally designed for adults with Parkinson's disease. And so this is a very structured therapy program that's 4 weeks long. You see the patient 4 times a week for an hour for 4 weeks to really have them learn how to talk loud. And not only does the target, the treatment target loudness improve in this group, but we also see that ratings of communication effectiveness increase, intelligibility increases, and things like swallowing increases, because we think we're strengthening different parts of the mouth and throat. So we've tried, other groups have tried this in kids with CP, and so we know it's safe. And so what we wanted to do was to see if we could do this with our kids with CP here at SDSU. And so here we have 4 participants. So it's kind of a feasibility study at this point, where we've looked at 3 individuals, so T1, T2, and T3, who received treatment. And then we had 1 control participant, so he had CP and did not get treatment at the same time that everyone else got treatment, but then was offered treatment after all the testing was done. And so, so for the most part, things worked, right? For these kids with CP, you can see that their pre-treatment intelligibility went up as much as 20% for some individuals, but for other ones, maybe a little bit less, 9%. In our field, we have research to show that an 8% to 9% change is clinically significant. So we saw a clinically significant change in intelligibility for all of our participants, and some of them continue to improve even 8 weeks after treatment, but the other 2 sort of reduced. Yeah, I'll if I have time, I'll come back to a thought I just had. In terms of whether or not we were able to get a change in loudness, we definitely did. So our child in purple is our control participant. There were no statistically significant differences, whether it was between before treatment, 2 weeks into what everyone else was having in terms of treatment, immediately, you know, after the 4-week treatment block, and then the follow-up 8 weeks later. And you can see the loudness here is on the vertical axis. For red, green, and blue, who are the ones who got treatment. So let's talk about the red and the blue ones first. So red and blue kind of started a little bit lower before treatment, and then after treatment improved, and that was a statistically significant finding, and then seemed to continue to improve in loudness after follow-up, even if the intelligibility for at least one of these children dropped a little bit. For the one in green, this is a child with a type of dysarthria of cerebral palsy where there's lots of involuntary movements. We call it the dyskinetic form of cerebral palsy. And you can see her standard deviations are really, really high. And so even though her loudness dropped and then kind of goes back to where it was, what we have done for her, or what this treatment seemed to have done for her, was to give her more control over that loudness. So there weren't like times where she was like really loud and then really soft. We got her to be able to be more consistent with her loudness, which allowed her to have more predictable loudness levels as she's talking, which makes it easier for people to understand her. We want to look at how speech movements change as a result of the treatment. And so when we look at jaw movements, we see that, again, our control participant in purple saw no changes, was flat the entire time. But overall, for red and blue, we see an increase in jaw movements. And then we see for our one in green with the dyskinetic form of CP, no real statistical change, but there is much smaller standard deviation bars for that. When we look at speech, the speed of movements and how quickly they're moving their jaw, for example, again, no real change in jaw speed for our control participant, but for the other three, we did see some speed changes as a result of therapy, though only one child, well, actually continued to gain in terms of speech speed, but the other two sort of dropped back down in reducing, or it dropped back down in terms of what it was pre-treatment. And then in terms of the measure of coordination, somewhat disappointingly was we did not see a difference in coordination pre-therapy to immediately post-therapy or even after follow-up. But what is interesting is sort of this these data points sort of 2 weeks within treatment. So you can kind of see, one of the children sort of increase in coordination, two sort of decrease. So what we think is this coordination metric, when we have them produce loud speech, might be a metric of how much their system might respond to a loudness treatment. So the fact that that they are changing their coordination perhaps means that there's something disrupting their system. So in dynamic systems theory, we're kind of shaking up their attractor state potentially, and then they get back to an attractor state even though the behavioral outcomes are have improved. They're louder, they're more intelligible, but they're sort of like back to normal. And that's not unusual to see. We see this in sort of like brain imaging studies after, say, intense aphasia treatment or intense speech treatment like LSVT in people with Parkinson's disease, where there is what we see in terms of brain activity using fMRI at baseline is very similar to sort of what they see 6 or 8 weeks post treatment, but there are sort of immediate or sort of intermediate changes in brain activity during or immediately after therapy, and then the brain activity goes back down to baseline, even though the behavioral outcomes are maintained even in follow-up. So, so in this sort of like pilot study, we've kind of shown that like this trial therapy, which was 4 weeks, 4 hours per week, was effective for these kids. We see a clinically significant increase in intelligibility for this group. As you probably know from your own research in psychology, sometimes the numbers that we use when we're using different scales and things may not entirely capture the whole story of what's going on, right? So someone with a score on, and I apologize if this is out of date, but the Beck depression index might be, 2 people may have the same values, but have very different sort of presentations of that depression, right? And it's the same thing with the intelligibility. So even though, if we kind of go back and we're seeing, oh, this child only got up to 13% intelligibility. That can't have been a huge change for her. But one of the things that we did was we had parents like in a survey kind of tell us what were some of the changes that they've seen. And so for this 14-year-old who had the dyskinetic type of CP and got up from 5% intelligibility to 13% intelligibility, it used to be mom, who was her caregiver, primary caregiver for 14 years of her life, could not understand her own daughter unless they were reading something together. So if they had text in front of them and they're both trying to read the same thing, then she could understand her daughter. By the time we were done with therapy, she and her daughter could have short conversations in the car. So the child was in the back seat because she was in a wheelchair, or whatever. Mom's out front driving. They couldn't do that because she wouldn't be able to see her face, but she could have a conversation with her without having that face-to-face interaction. And that was a huge quality of life improvement for mom. So that was really, really good. And so coordination may be a useful predictor for who might benefit from this type of therapy, but more research obviously is required. And so in future directions, I'm interested to see how this sort of scales if we kind of do it with a larger group of children with CP, but also looking at other speech modifications that are commonly used in the field, such as having them talk more clearly or having them talk more slowly as initial directions to kind of get a better sense of what the underlying mechanism of changes for intelligibility in this group, and then using that information down the line to maybe come up with more novel or innovative therapies that are much more tailored to the individual. So want to thank everyone. I want to respect your time. I know I've run a little bit over given so that you have questions, but I want to thank the funding sources for this research for SDSU, and for all of you for inviting me and for your time and attention. Thank you.
Thank you. There
Thank
any
you.
questions?
If you do not feel comfortable posting your questions or unmuting yourself, please send them to Brian. He will be monitoring them.
I have a question.
Okay.
So if a student getting a BA in psychology is interested in this area, what would be some of the steps they would have to do to go into your master's program?
That's a really great question. So so there are about 300 training programs across the country. And everyone is going to be a little bit different in terms of their requirements. But generally speaking, if you go to our website, SLA, I'll type in the chat actually as I'm talking, you'll kind of see what we require for our applicants. And so there are typically specific coursework pieces that we want. Even if, because I know Humboldt State doesn't have a communication disorders and sciences department or a speech language and hearing sciences department. But there are a lot of places where people will get, say, a degree in psychology, for example, and then spend about a year getting those prerequisite courses done, and then applying to the MA program. So a lot of these programs, so we have one actually here at SDSU that you can take entirely online, and it allows you to get all the courses done within about a year or less. So that would be the one thing. So we require those prerequisites. And then your typical requirements for a grad school application, statement of intent, 3 letters of recommendation. And we as a university have, aside from a couple of programs, have entirely waived the GRE. So we no longer require the GRE for applicants.
Yay.
Yeah.
Follow up. Is there a high demand for speech pathologists?
Why, Maria? I thank you for that question. Yes, there is a very high demand. So currently, speech language pathology is ranked as, like, I think number 25, I want to say, in the top growing professions nationally for the next 10 years. And there's even more demand in California if you separate out state data compared to nationally. So it's a good career. I think if you go to that website that I had at the very beginning, which was in the slideshow and then go up, speech and hearing careers.org, or hearing and speech careers.org. You'll kind of see more information about that, or find out more about that, hearing and speech careers.org. It's a good salary, so it's not unusual for our students to come out making $70,000 a year as a speech language pathologist working in the school districts, which is nice. You get your winter break, you get your summer break, you get to participate in the state pension system, and have the flexibility to move around the country. The one nice thing about our national association, so the American Speech Language Hearing Association, has done a really good job of making sure that the national certification standards are lined up with all the state licensure requirements. So you could get trained, for example, in Nebraska, and then come back to California and work as a speech language pathologist and have no difficulty in finding a job.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we really do love students who come in with a different background, you know, so you have a psychology degree and then you go back and your prerequisite and then come to a master's degree. Not only, so the way school districts work is when they put you on a salary scale, they look at how many units you've taken since your BA or BS. And so all those prerequisite courses that everyone has to take adds to the number of units you've taken after your BA, so then you actually get paid more than somebody who went straight through in their undergrad as a speech language hearing sciences major. So so that's another plus too. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know where I was going with that. But yeah, it's a really great career. I encourage you to do it, or if you're interested in research, as we were talking on Tuesday during the roundtable, there's a desperate need for PhDs in our area. So if you are even remotely interested in communication or language or something along those lines, autism, that kind of thing, you know, do think about our departments when you're looking for a job, if that is of interest to you. Or come here for a PhD.
It's a joint one, right? With
yeah,
University
it's a joint one with UCSD. Yeah, so that I think has some really fun possibilities for students because they get to interact with so many faculty members from 6 different departments across 2 different universities. So.
Do we have any more questions for Dr. Nip? We are at the hour mark, so if there are any more questions, I am going to conclude this meeting. Thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Dr. Nip, for taking the time to talk about your research. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you all.
Thank you. And thank you for everybody who is watching this on YouTube. We'll see you next time.